When a major semiconductor company sits down at the world's biggest PC hardware show and publicly says that something has to give with memory prices, that is not a throwaway comment. That is an executive signal that the industry is under serious strain and that the current situation is unsustainable in ways that are starting to hurt everyone in the ecosystem. That is exactly what Intel's Nish Neelojanan, Senior Director of Product Management for Intel's Client Computing Group, told Tom's Hardware at Computex 2026. He said, and these are his words, that longer term, something has to give with memory price over inflation. It was a candid and remarkably direct admission from a company that has its own competitive interests tied to the health of the broader PC market, and it opens up a conversation that the hardware industry has been having in whispers for months but is now having out loud. To understand why Intel's comment matters as much as it does, you need to understand the scale of what has happened to memory prices over the past year and a half. DDR4 spot prices jumped approximately 2,200% over a 12-month period before falling just 5% recently in what was described as the first decline in nearly a year. That 5% drop sounds like relief, but it is essentially noise against the backdrop of a price increase measured in thousands of percent. DDR5 has followed a similar trajectory, with meaningful price increases across all capacity points that have pushed the cost of building or buying a PC meaningfully higher than it was just 18 months ago. NAND flash prices for SSDs have also been rising consistently, compounding the memory cost problem with storage cost pressure simultaneously. The result is that consumers trying to build or buy a PC in 2026 are facing a component cost environment that is materially more expensive than anything they have experienced in recent memory. The root cause of this memory crisis is something we have covered on this channel before but is worth revisiting in this context because it shapes how realistic any near-term relief actually is. The global memory supply chain is being consumed by artificial intelligence infrastructure demand at a pace that manufacturers were simply not prepared for. AI data centers need high-bandwidth memory for their accelerator chips, standard DRAM for their server CPU configurations, and NAND flash for their storage systems in quantities that are growing faster than production capacity can expand. Memory manufacturers including Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron have been shifting their production allocation toward the higher-margin enterprise memory products that AI customers demand, which has reduced the supply of consumer-grade DDR5 and DDR4 available to the PC market. Building new production capacity requires years of planning, billions in capital investment, and fab construction timelines that cannot be compressed to meet sudden demand spikes. The industry is caught between a demand surge it did not fully anticipate and a supply expansion timeline that is measured in years rather than months. Intel's specific comment about something having to give reflects the company's own strategic vulnerability in this memory environment. Intel has been working hard to stage a competitive comeback in the PC CPU market through their Panther Lake laptop chips built on the 18A manufacturing process and their upcoming Nova Lake desktop platform. Both of these products are genuinely competitive offerings that the company has been counting on to recover market share lost to AMD over the past several years. But the memory crisis is working directly against Intel's comeback narrative. PC manufacturers including Dell have been raising commercial PC prices by 10 to 30% in response to rising memory costs. Lenovo warned explicitly that PC and laptop prices would need to rise in 2026 as the company's stockpile of components acquired at pre-crisis prices runs out. Higher PC prices mean lower overall demand for PCs, which means fewer CPU sales for Intel at exactly the moment when the company needs strong volume to rebuild market share momentum. The Intel representative's comment about continuing to make sure there are products which can take care of older memory technologies reveals an interesting and practically significant aspect of how the industry is responding to the memory crisis. The reference to older memory technologies points directly to DDR4, which has been staging an unexpected comeback as the DDR5 crisis has driven both manufacturers and consumers back toward the older standard as a cost management strategy. Multiple sources at Computex 2026 confirmed to hardware reporters that motherboard manufacturers and memory module producers are seeing an increase in demand for DDR4 platforms and are shifting production accordingly. This DDR4 revival is a market-driven response to the cost environment that Intel is acknowledging it needs to accommodate rather than force everyone onto DDR5 at current pricing levels. The DDR4 revival story is a fascinating and somewhat ironic development in the 2026 memory market. The industry had been planning and communicating a clear transition to DDR5 as the universal standard for new PC builds, with DDR4 expected to decline steadily in relevance as newer platforms move to DDR5 exclusively. The memory crisis has disrupted that orderly transition in ways nobody planned for. DDR4 pricing, while also elevated above historical norms, remains more accessible than DDR5 for most consumers and system builders. The challenge with a DDR4 revival is that high-performance DDR4 dies, including the Samsung B dies that enthusiasts have favored for years, are no longer in production. The manufacturing capacity for advanced DDR4 has largely been converted to DDR5 production, which means that while demand for DDR4 platforms is increasing, the supply of high-quality DDR4 memory that buyers expect is constrained in its own way. A genuinely new development in the memory crisis response that emerged from Computex 2026 is the introduction of the HUDIMM specification, which stands for High Utilization DIMM. This new memory module standard has been developed specifically as a response to the DDR5 pricing crisis, with the explicit goal of slashing DDR5 prices by enabling different and potentially lower-cost manufacturing. Approaches to DDR5 modules. The HUDIMM specification represents the memory industry acknowledging that the current DDR5 module manufacturing approach needs to evolve to make the technology accessible at price points that the consumer PC market can actually absorb. Details on exactly how HUDIMM achieves its cost reduction goals and when commercial products based on the specification will be available are still emerging, but its introduction at Computex 2026 is a signal that the industry is actively working on structural solutions to the pricing crisis rather than simply waiting for the supply-demand imbalance to resolve itself organically. The specific downstream effects of the memory crisis on PC builds in 2026 are worth spelling out concretely for anyone trying to navigate the current market. A mid-range desktop PC build that would have cost around $800 to $1,000 18 months ago now costs meaningfully more when accounting for the increased prices of RAM and SSD storage. The impact is proportionally larger on budget builds where memory and storage represent a higher fraction of the total component cost. Laptop buyers are seeing configurations that were previously offered with 16 GB of RAM being reduced to 8 GB at the same price point, or the same 16 GB configuration costing more than it did a year ago. These are not hypothetical projections but documented reality that consumers have been experiencing at retail since late 2025. Intel's acknowledgement that this situation is unsustainable is validating what PC builders and buyers have been feeling directly in their own wallets. The Framework laptop company's communication with its customers on this topic deserves specific mention because it represents one of the most transparent and consumer-friendly responses to the memory crisis from any PC hardware company. Framework warned its customers explicitly about continuing price increases for RAM and SSD components, explaining the market forces driving those increases in clear language and giving buyers the information they need to make informed purchasing decisions rather than hiding the pricing reality behind vague mentions of supply chain challenges. That kind of transparency is rare in the consumer electronics industry and reflects Framework's broader philosophy of treating customers as informed partners rather than as passive recipients of whatever pricing the market bears. Intel's similar candor at Computex 2026 in acknowledging that prices must change is a step in that direction from a much larger and more established company. The question of when memory prices will actually come down is the most practically important one for anyone planning a PC purchase or build, and the honest answer based on all available industry information is not as soon as anyone would hope. Sources across the memory supply chain who spoke to hardware publications at Computex 2026 largely agreed that DRAM and NAND shortages will continue throughout all of 2027, with meaningful consumer price relief unlikely before late 2027 at the earliest. The new production capacity that memory manufacturers approved in response to the current shortage is coming online gradually on semiconductor timescales that are measured in years. The AI infrastructure build-out that is consuming the bulk of available memory production is not moderating. And the geopolitical complications affecting global semiconductor supply chains are structural rather than temporary. When Intel says something has to give, they are expressing a hope and an expectation rather than a near-term prediction. The strategies available to PC builders navigating this difficult environment are the same ones we have discussed on this channel but bear repeating given how sustained the challenge has proven to be. Watching for promotional pricing and sales events remains one of the most effective ways to find temporary value in a broadly rising market. Being honest about actual current needs rather than speculative future capacity means spending money on RAM and storage you will actually use rather than overpaying for headroom you may never need. Considering DDR4 platform options if you are building a new system from scratch may offer a more accessible entry point given the current DDR5 pricing environment, though that calculation depends on your specific performance requirements and long-term upgrade plans. And staying informed about developments like the HUDIMM specification and DDR4 production restarts gives you the context to recognize when market conditions are genuinely shifting in ways that could affect your purchasing timing. Intel's something has to give comment is ultimately most significant not for what it proposes as a solution but for what it signals about the industry's collective recognition of the problem. When a company with Intel's market position, Intel's visibility into OEM pricing dynamics, and Intel's direct interest in healthy PC market demand publicly says that the current memory price environment is unsustainable, it adds authoritative weight to what PC builders and buyers have been experiencing firsthand. It also increases the pressure on memory manufacturers to accelerate their supply expansion timelines and on the broader industry to find structural solutions like HUDIMM that can help normalize pricing faster than the organic supply-demand cycle would on its own. The memory crisis is real, it is sustained, and it will not resolve overnight. But the fact that major players are speaking about it openly and pushing for change is at least a signal that the industry is engaged with the problem rather than pretending it does not exist. The broader lesson from Intel's public statement at Computex 2026 is that the memory crisis has reached a stage where even companies with significant market power and institutional interest in maintaining the status quo are acknowledging that the current trajectory is harmful to the ecosystem they depend on. Memory manufacturers benefit from high prices in the short term but risk destroying the consumer PC market's health in ways that ultimately reduce their own long-term revenue. PC makers benefit from selling higher-priced systems but risk losing customers who defer purchases because the total cost of a new system has become too high. Intel benefits from selling more processors but cannot sell them into systems that people will not buy because memory costs have made those systems too expensive.